Good morning, people. Today we have a progression of a very illuminating talk which was given to us by Julia Bailey a few sessions ago. We are now going to continue that with the title, Julia Bailey, Gender, Your Questions Asked and Answered. So, without further ado, Julie.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Ray. And very nice to see people again. I'm just going to share my screen. So yes, we had a really good conversation last time. Gender and sexuality are topics that confuse very many people. So there's a lot to unpick, and thank you very much for inviting me back to further the conversations. It's called Your Questions Answered. I'm not sure we're actually going to be able to do that within 1 hour because it is complicated, but it's great to be able to discuss things. And I've had your questions via Patsy, so I've got those on slides that we can come to. So I am I work in sexual health. I'm a doctor, trained as a GP. I do a lot of teaching about gender, sex and sexuality. So that's medical students and research students. And my research is all about sexual health online. So it's mobile phones and the internet for sexual health promotion. And I also teach and research about access to sexual health services. So particularly for groups who find it hard to be acknowledged within services. So trans and non-binary very much comes into that. And myself, I identify as non-binary and genderqueer. I can come back to explain a little bit more about what I mean. And my pronouns, again, I'll come back to this, I'm not too bothered, but I really, really don't like being called lady or madam. People say ladies and gentlemen. That's not something I identify with, but we can go by she. You can say Julia, she said this, that, and the other, that's fine. So just to sort of set the frame for discussions, this is a space where we can be open with each other, hopefully, to explore topics, trying to avoid assumptions about each other. So it's not that trans and non-binary people are somewhere else and in some other context. Actually, any of us may have different understandings of our own gender. Any of us need to disclose how we know something. So it might be our own experience, it might be a friend, it might be something we've read in the paper, who knows, but we don't need to ask each other, how do you know that? Unless it's a fact, in which case we can obviously fact check. And then, be part of the discussion if you want to and not if you don't want to. So it'll hopefully be thought-provoking. Some of the ideas can be quite challenging. So let's all notice our emotional responses. It's quite interesting to think, why am I feeling sort of angry about that or upset, or is this new to me? And welcome all questions. So don't hold back, even if you think it might be a kind of silly question. And we can challenge each other, and let's make sure everyone can contribute. So if you've been talking a lot, please then step down and let other people talk. And equally, if you want to say something, then please step up and join in. So I want to show you a video. This is Jay's story. It's a few minutes long to give you an idea of, to sort of have somebody in mind. This is a trans man. So you've got in mind a particular kind of person. It's going to change to a different screen. Okay. Nope, that hasn't worked. Oh, sorry, I think I need to share the sound. Sorry, technical hitch.
I lived as a gay woman up until sort of my early 20s. And I think my final year...
I was about 22, I started binding my chest. And it was strange because I still didn't know that I wanted to be male. I still didn't know that I was trans. I just knew that I was really different, that my body didn't quite fit. And then I really hit rock bottom. I came to a place where I knew that what I was doing wasn't right. It didn't make sense for me. And after a lot of thinking, I realised that what was really going on was that I was trans, that I felt like a guy. It was a really mixed feeling. I felt extremely relieved that I finally knew what was wrong or what was happening to me. But it was also really quite traumatizing because I thought that I was going to have to, move into this space where I was just going to be rejected by everyone, and that my life would essentially be over. But I felt that was my only option, that was who I was, and I had to start that process.
I'm just going to commentate as we go along. So somebody who was assigned female at birth, so taken to be a girl, but then in childhood felt, actually, this isn't me, felt male. And it's really very common for it to be a bit of a catastrophe in terms of thinking, oh God, what on earth does this mean for me? Because it's a road less travelled, and particularly perhaps for children, depending on who's around them and what they've heard about transness or gender at all, actually, because it's often very taken for granted that a child is either male, female, and we may not have heard of any other options.
I initially spoke to my GP, who was unhelpful, and so I changed GPs and went to one who wasn't prejudiced, which was really good, and he was great. He was really, really helpful. He spoke to the PCT. They advised him that I needed to see a psychiatrist, and I was really fortunate. There was a psychiatrist there who used to work in a gender clinic, who had some awareness of the issues and was actually able to be really supportive. That was where I started to feel like it might actually be okay, and that it wasn't going to mean the end of everything, but it was more of a beginning. I met my partner just about a year before I started hormones. She instantly just talked to me as male, assumed I was male, even though I still, looked quite female. And there were no problems. It was really, really nice to meet someone who could actually just do that.
Obviously, when I first met him, he was trans, but he hadn't started transitioning at all yet. And my only fear, I suppose, with the relationship when it started was that I'm straight. And obviously, from an outsider looking in, it looked like we were a gay couple. But
Let me just pause there. So, two people who were read as female, appeared to be female, but one who feels male and the other one who feels female, gender identity female. So the distinction with sexuality is about who you're attracted to.
Never seen him as anything other than male.
We're going climbing next weekend?
Yes.
The hormone therapy was interesting, and obviously I had a huge amount of testosterone in my body, so there was only one thing on my mind. Luckily that does tail off over time, and I can think of other things now, which is quite helpful. My period stopped more or less after the first shot. I was really lucky. Some people it takes longer. My voice started to break after about a month. It took a good year and a half for it to properly settle down. My body shape completely changed, whereas I'd had a sort of hourglass figure before, I'm much more straight down now. And it was really quite sudden. I remember looking in the mirror one day thinking, where have my hips and my thighs gone? And then realised they were around my stomach. Now, I could occasionally pass as male if people couldn't see that I had breasts. I knew that I did not want to have breasts at all. That was the biggest thing for me. So for me, one of my main priorities was to have a mastectomy. The first time I think I came back from the hospital and I walked past the window topless without having to go like that, it was just fantastic. It was great. And yeah, it's been one of the most amazing things that I've had done. There are lots of reasons why people decide to have genital surgery or not. In some ways, I think I would like to do it just because I would like to experience that, to know what that feels like. But for me and for some guys I know, being a man isn't necessarily about whether or not I have a penis. I don't have to do that in order to see myself as male. I see myself as male. I see myself as a trans male, particularly anyway.
And now we've got over this transition and Jay is who he wants to be. Our relationship is just like any normal relationship now. We're planning to get married next year, and then we're going to go down the IVF route and have some children. And so we've just sort of, now that all that pressure is off, we've gone into a normal relationship now and are doing what any normal couple would do.
It's only a part of my life. It was the biggest thing in my life for a couple of years while I was transitioning, because you have to go through that process. But now it's just a part of who I am. There's so many more parts to me. There's my job and my relationships and my hobbies and my social life, and that I'm trans.
Lovely, thank you. I'll stop share.
I lived as a gay woman up until sort of my early 20s. And I think in my final year.
So just a quick revision of some sort of key terms and concepts. So at birth, we're put into these binary categories. You know, literally the first question that people ask is it a male or female, girl or boy, when a baby's born? And that the term for that is assigned at birth. So on the basis of a baby's genitals, it's assumed that this is a boy child or a girl child. But up to about 1.7% of the population are intersex, so have sex variations, which means that their genetics, so a variation on X or Y, XY or XX, so something different to that, plus or minus genitals, plus or minus hormones, at birth or later, doesn't fit neatly into the male or female. So biological sex is definitely more complicated than just two categories. And that's a physical fact. It's not, you can't decide to be intersex. You either are or you're not. I'm thinking about gender. So gender identity is our internal sense of gender. So I guess for most people in society, you're assigned one particular gender, grow up in that gender, and your gender identity is concordant. So there's no kind of conflict. It doesn't change through life, although it's complicated because of all the sort of social pressures about who we should be, how we should act. And then gender expression is the way that gender is expressed to other people. So it might be through what we wear, body modifications, behavior. So things like jobs and roles in society are very, very gendered. But gender expression, so the outward signs, if you like, are different to gender identity, which is what is inside. And here's a couple of people. Monica Roberts is a trans woman who died in 2020. So just so you have sort of people in mind while we're talking about trans women. So Monica will have been assigned male at birth, but her gender identity and gender expression is female. And then Freddie McConnell is a Guardian journalist, so assigned female at birth, and gender identity, gender expression, male, and pronouns. So Monica as a trans woman goes by she, her as the pronouns, and Freddie is he, him. So on to cis and trans. So cisgender means that gender identity is the same as assigned at birth. So there's no conflict, there's no change over time, and in distinction from trans, so for people where it's different from the gender assigned at birth. So in the short film we saw they're trans, yeah, because they were a different gender at birth. And non-binary gender. So this overlaps with gender queer. So non-binary means stepping away from the binary, the two categorization of male or female, perhaps into the middle or stepping aside from it completely. And gender queer meaning really not subscribing to those kind of conceptions at all, trying to step away from the whole thing. It might be being fluid about it at different times, or understanding gender in a different way. So queer meaning stepping away from those categorizations, gender queer. And that's me. So I feel I'm non-binary and gender queer, but it depends who's asking and what for. So if we're talking about a gender pay gap, then I'm female, and I don't object to being female, but I just find the distinction between male and female really quite unhelpful in lots of different ways. So non-binary genderqueer people, you can't necessarily tell. As with anybody's gender, it's internal, so you can't tell by looking. But non-binary people might be androgynous or not. It's up to them. And here's two people in the public eye. So Jack Monroe, who goes by they or she, so Jack's non-binary, and Travis Alabanza, so goes by they, Travis is they. So quite a sort of masculine name, Travis, but a non-binary internal sense of gender, and gender expression is quite kind of feminine. So can you tell someone's gender by looking? Shout out, yes or no? No, basically. Gender identity is internal. And a word on pronouns. So he, she, they are very important in acknowledging and affirming somebody's gender identity. So some non-binary people may choose they as a gender neutral pronoun. There are others in circulation, and there's some examples, but they haven't caught on in anywhere near the same sort of way that they has. There's a question from you later on about querying how well they work, so we'll come to that. So important not to guess or assume someone's gender identity and pronouns. So often in meetings, especially perhaps with younger people, there's a round, so you introduce yourself and you can state your pronouns as well. Sometimes people put that on Zoom. And just to flag up, this is really confusing. It's confusing to all of us because understandings change over time, terminology changes. So yeah. If you can't quite get to grips with it, that's not at all surprising. So to clarify that gender is distinct from sexuality. Gender is our own internal sense. Sexuality is who we're attracted to. So gay is attraction between two men, lesbian to women, bisexual is attracted to other sexualities. So expressions of sexual attraction. The acronym LGBTQIA, that's what it stands for. So some of those are sexualities and some are genders. So lesbian, gay, bisexual are sexualities because that's about attraction. Transgender is about gender. Queer can mean either genderqueer or so sexuality or gender. It's confusing, but there are many, many ways of expressing sexuality and gender. And a word on anatomy and bodies. So anatomy doesn't dictate gender. And trans and non-binary people might feel distressed about their bodies or not really. And the distress might come actually through other people. So particularly if somebody realizes they're trans and they feel that they've been assigned the wrong gender as a child, if the responses of those around them are really quite negative, then that's where a lot of the distress can come. So it may not be kind of intrinsic. It's complicated to unpick where distress comes from, but an awful lot of it comes from society's responses rather than internally. And then trans and non-binary people might want to have hormones and surgery or not. So the terms upper means kind of chest, breast, and lower means genital surgery. But you can be trans or non-binary, but without any sort of changes to the body. This is quite a useful picture that unpicks the different concepts. So you've got identity as our own sense of our own gender. Attraction, so who we're attracted to is sexuality. Sex is the biological reality. And expression is what do we actually wear? How do we behave? Roles in society, that sort of thing. And I can forward this slide so you can have a look more if you like. So, what do you think is this person's sex? You can put it in the chat if you like. You can see the chat on your...
Is that a question you wanted asked, or is that an expression? Sorry, I didn't understand.
I was wondering if anyone is feeling brave and would like to hazard a guess.
Male. Male for sex.
Male, yeah, I would go for that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say mostly male. Yep.
Uh-huh. How do we know that this person isn't intersex?
We don't.
Yeah. Yes, that's quite right. I mean, most of us actually don't know our own genetics. I've never had a test to check whether I've got XY chromosomes. Because it seems straightforward. But this person might be intersex. They may have chromosomes and hormones actually from birth that are more complicated than just male or female. How about, what's this person's gender, do you think?
Don't know.
Non-binary.
Yeah, they might, they might be any gender, to be honest. So we don't know. Gender is an internal sense. So we would need to ask. So we would need to ask, what are your pronouns? And if it's relevant, what's your gender? So we can guess that they might be non-binary, or they might be trans. They might be on a pathway to, a trans feminine identity and expression. Gender expression is what people are wearing. So more kind of feminine clothing, typically. But who's to say it is more feminine? It's just that's what we've come to agree is kind of feminine expression. So, Hattie.
I mean, I've got a picture, an old picture. It's of a relative, is a child dressed in this little blue skirt, almost like a tutu, really. Very lovely. And boys wore skirts. That was normal. I mean, I guess it helped to change them and toilet them when they were little babs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a social convention, isn't it? What we dress people in, what we dress ourselves in. There's a sort of funny hissing noise. Is that? I wonder if that's. Let me mute you. So yeah, this person is gender diverse. So in other words, they step outside their kind of male-female categorization. What's your response? So have a think about, what's your emotional response to seeing this person? Do you feel confused, curious, cross, happy? You don't need to answer it out loud, but just to think, spend a moment thinking, what do I think about someone who steps outside the kind of predictable?
She seems so friendly that you just want to get to know her, I think.
Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah. Yeah.
I would feel, I think before I sort of answered your questions and you said it could be anything, I don't know, like I should know. So it's good to know that actually I don't need to make those sort of assumptions or know, because it is their identity.
That's a really good point. Is, well, firstly, why do we need to know anyway? So if this person's coming in to buy some stamps and we work in a post office, does it matter? Why do we actually need to know? But yes, always needing to check with somebody about their own identity or their own preferences, and that, yeah, we can't tell by looking and shouldn't feel worried if we can't tell by looking. I mean, I think, as with ethnicity and age and gender, it's things that we take in absolutely instantaneously about somebody else. And we're sort of socialized to do that. But then stepping back and thinking, why does it matter? If I can't tell if this person is male or female, it may feel a bit uncomfortable, but does it matter?
I think it matters if you hope to have a conversation with the person, because you need a few sort of instinctive guidelines as to how you're going to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. Why would it mean that you are, tell me more, Mum. So needing to know what someone's gender is.
Well, it's a bit like somebody who doesn't seem to be English white. You immediately think you want to know, where are you from? Which of course is non-PC, but knowledge of that does help you conversationally, or you think it might.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very often possible to step back from those questions and think, okay, so what, I am curious, but to think about how that might land on somebody. So if the first question they're asked in lots and lots and lots of different situations are things like, where are you from? Or are you a boy or a girl? Actually, that can feel very, very challenging. It's difficult. Yeah. So to find other things to talk about or to find in common is usually a better idea. And maybe a bit later, somebody would want to talk to you about more about themselves, but that it's quite good to just step back from that curiosity.
Also, the person whom you're addressing, do they sometimes feel unsure how to answer or how to be?
That's a really good question as well, is that they may not really know themselves, to be honest. So yes, you might be asking them something that's incredibly complicated and they're really not sure how to even start answering that question.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. So to go on to some of the questions that you sent in, so the elderly in the UK, and I would say it's not just the elderly, are generally confused, uninterested or irritated by vocabulary to describe gender and sexuality. So how familiar are younger people? Is knowledge and thinking clear or woolly? I think generally younger people are much more on the ball and less bothered by the rigid categorizations. So a much more fluid conceptualizations about gender and sexuality, a much more freedom about how to express themselves. But that's definitely not always true. Definitely not. It varies by all sorts of factors. So the expectations of family or wider culture, within London, it's going to be very different to other parts of the UK, for example. But in general, I would say that the younger people, the students I teach, are pretty familiar with the concept of, what are your pronouns, and the flexibility in sexuality and gender. But it very much depends. We've got lots of overseas students and these concepts may be extremely familiar to them or not at all. So it does depend. And it is a topic that's making some people extremely cross. A minute, sorry, it's gone on. Yeah, and where did it all come from? Gosh, I think, looking back through history and in different cultural contexts, you can find evidence of gender diversity from very, very, very long ago. But it's become much more current recently in the last, 10 years? So I think in parallel with things like gay activism, actually gender identity and realizing that people who are trans are a population who are quite oppressed and marginalized and judged. So that there's been political campaigns to try and empower people. So I think it's risen to the top. It's a particular thing in the UK, which is confusing other people a lot. I think, our overseas students are wondering what on earth is going on in the UK with the ferocity of some of the arguments. So it's definitely not a universally contested thing in quite the same way. But in lots of settings, trans people are on the receiving end of loads of violence, including being killed, and particularly Black trans women in many, many settings. So I guess, the rise of a realization that there are so many differences and that our identity is incredibly important and that gender is a very important, excluded group, gender diverse people. So I've been clear for the past 50 years, there's a distinction between sex as biological, if ambiguous, fact, and gender as a social construct. So I agree with this completely. Sex is biological. You can't change that. I mean, you can alter hormones that are on board and you can alter bodies, but you can't change your genetics. You probably will be able to in future, but for now, you really can't change your genetics or the genitals, the internal configuration. So you can perhaps have some surgeries, but yeah, I agree. Sex is a biological fact, and gender is the way that society responds to us. So if I identify as female, there's particular things that are expected of me as a woman in society, and that's very much the interaction with society. Buying a particular types of clothes for girls and boys, particular types of toys, expecting them to do particular types of things in life is socially constructed. It's not a biological inevitability. So in the current debate, sex and gender appear to have become conflated, which is causing confusion. And I quite agree that I think they're different, but there's some gender critical scholars and activists who are saying, actually, they believe that people are born male or female and that they can never change that. That's a sort of reality that can't be changed. So that leads people to say, okay, there's no such thing as a trans woman or a trans man. They remain the gender that they were at birth. And that's the basis of what the argument is all about, is can people change their gender or not? And I think if it's all about how we are in society and our internal feelings, then of course we can, but some people believe we can't. So how many gender identities are there under the umbrella of non-binary? Can I describe some of them? So this is an interesting question, and there's probably more. So agender means no gender. So some people would like to get away from the entire thing and describe themselves as agender, no gender at all. And in some ways that's nicer than kind of non-binary, which is in opposition to the binary. But just trying to get away from it. We can't get away from it because it's absolutely everywhere in society. You know, try to order any product and you have to choose between men's shoes, women's bags, men's bags, whatever. It's it's impossible to get away from the binary. So another identity is gender fluid. So seeing our own gender as changeable over time, changeable day by day, flexible in different circumstances. So that's one kind of non-binary identity, or getting away from the whole thing. These are links to videos you might find interesting to watch another time. So about how colonialism and British or Western conceptions of the binary gender have influenced other people in other settings. So that there's lots and lots of cultural heritage which didn't see gender as just binary. It does see it as more complex. So there's a couple of examples. Two-Spirit people in Canada, so the indigenous population. So that's something like non-binary from what I understand. And the Mujeres, Mexico's third gender. And again, those are links to videos if you want to watch another time. So there's so many examples from across the globe and across history of where gender is not binary. So pronouns that people choose. So there are lots that could be used. So here's some examples. And this is a common sort of challenge, is I think of them as plural. And that's quite confusing. And I agree, I think it is confusing. You know, if you're talking about somebody, you don't know if you're talking about two people or somebody on their own with the they pronoun for non-binary. But the ship has sailed in many ways. It is a popular use, and we do use it in English already. So if you find a piece of lost property, you'll say, oh, someone's left their jumper on the train, and we don't have a problem with that. So they is already used in English as a gender neutral pronoun. But I personally don't use it because I do think it's quite confusing. I would prefer another one, really. And then this was from somebody. I react when I see people dressed up like exaggerated dolls. How come people work in the front line with the public and that's how they present every day? I don't know how to react sometimes. I feel I cannot see a real person. It can be hard to take someone seriously. Yes, it does change with time and getting to interact with them though. So I think, you know, it's so powerful, the social expectations of how we're supposed to look. And if you step outside of that, even in a very small way, it can feel very challenging. So if somebody with a beard and in a suit has a long pink nails, for instance. So something really very small, it can make people kind of bristle and feel challenged about, oh gosh, well, what gender are you? And, you know, to feel that this is a good example, kind of, this is unprofessional, or you're just messing about. But I think it's really good to step back and ask yourself, where's that coming from? And to notice the strength of your own reactions, actually. Why is it upsetting you a lot? So if somebody is not presenting as expected or not behaving as expected, actually for us all, why is that upsetting? And I think it comes from the very deeply ingrained and reinforced expectations in society. And you give yourself the, you know, way out of it too, changes with time, getting to interact with somebody. So yes, getting to know somebody really changes your understanding of who they are. Yeah, I think it's good to unpick emotional reactions. Being with transgender men leaves me edgy, less able to go up and say hello. Even if I've known them in their born as gender from the past, that may make it harder. So if you know somebody who's changed their gender, it might be a bit more complicated getting your head around their new gender. It probably is, actually. If you've only ever met someone who is trans in their current gender, it's probably easier to get on board with it. I think it's fair to say that people who are visibly trans or gender diverse, so stepping out of the binary, you know, it's challenging probably in every single situation, every single day, to be that person. So yes, it might make other people uncomfortable, but think of the person themselves. They're likely to be needing a lot of courage, actually, to go out into the world and be who they are. Older trans dressers and genders, think it may be harder. Maybe not, I don't know. I think it all depends who's around us at any time. What's the situation and circumstance? You know, are you a young person on an arts degree? Are you a CEO of a big organization? It may make masses of difference as to how accepted you can be. Curiosity, so to stare at people. You know, it's natural, isn't it, to be curious about other people. So it can be a difficult balance, kind of behaving naturally, normally with people, but just to try and think, well, what would I usually do in this circumstance? And to try not to do anything particularly different. Don't be extra nice, but don't avoid people either. And how can we come to understand and actively explore gender? How can we support each other's different manifestations? So some things which might feel difficult to take on board. So somebody who's comes across as a businessman, dresses like a peacock to roam clubs at night. So stepping back from that and thinking, what's wrong with that? Why not? Shouldn't we all be allowed to explore in whatever way we want to? And then people who perhaps kind of going down conventional routes, so solemn lesbian wives, embrace heterosexual language to justify their choice. So yeah, I mean, if there's a whole institution about marriage, partnership, calling people husbands and wives or wife and wife, is tapping into some of the kind of ways of conventionally being coupled. And some of us who want to step away from that might feel critical of that too. So I think that's a great question. How can we come to understand and actively explore gender? What do you think?
Oh, questions and comments.
I think. Sorry.
I was just pondering on how the general population has accepted Grayson Perry. But as you say, he's associated with art, so that seems to be more acceptable.
Yes. Yes, also, you know, being familiar with what Grayson is saying and not just the image of Grayson, but actually knowing a bit more about engaging with that person.
There's a hand up by Judith Brown. Does that mean there's a question there? I ought to know, but I don't.
I
See?
don't see a hand.
Oh, no.
Hmm.
No, it's I don't know what that hand means. Sorry, I ought to know.
It's usually in very large groups if you have people do that, you know, because they can be seen to ask questions, but I can't see any hands here at the moment.
Oh, Patsy, it might be your cursor. So if it's over somebody, it becomes a little hand thing.
Ah, well, good.
Who's your cursor off the screen, Patsy? I think you see it disappears.
So what are your thoughts, questions, comments? Hattie.
Indeed.
Ray, you started speaking, so.
No, you carry on, my dear.
Well, I just think Grayson Perry is very bold and brave, actually. Obviously, he's over the years he's settled with himself quite a lot, but I mean he's expressing himself, and I really don't know how much he speaks about gender identity. He just does it, as far as I'm concerned, and there he is, apparently enjoying his life loads and involving loads of people. And I mean, it's so admirable, I think. And I really did enjoy the exhibition at the Bristol Museum. That's the sort of closest I've come to. Oh no, I saw the Arnold Feeney as well, but he's really interacting with the world a lot.
Yes, and it's probably a pretty difficult decision to be very gender variant, you know, to express yourself in ways that are not expected. So,
and he loves his motorbikes. Her motorbikes. I don't know what his pronoun is.
Yeah, I'm not up to date with Grayson's gender identity.
Something that occurred to me listening to the young man in the video at the beginning. I hadn't realized that if you're transing from female to male, the hormones will actually change your voice. But is that age related, or because my impression from people I know is that if you are going from male to female, and if your voice is already changed, there doesn't seem to be, you know, apart from learning, which most people nowadays don't seem to bother with, there isn't an easy way of speaking like a, you know, with a woman's voice, if you see what I mean.
In a higher pitch, yes.
Yeah.
No, you're right. Yeah, so taking testosterone lowers the voice, I think, at any age. I don't see why it wouldn't be
Right,
at
yeah.
any age. So if you're female and take testosterone, and you're right that once the vocal cords have grown,
Yeah.
then trans women learn to speak at a higher pitch, but that's quite a challenge.
Yeah, because I mean, many years ago when I was young, one of the gay groups I belonged to had speakers along, and we had a man who actually liked cross-dressing, and I found it was very interesting because you know, he said he was straight, he still fancied women when he was dressed as a woman, but it was very important to him that he moved and spoke and acted like a woman, and realized once when he thought he'd go camping that in fact that didn't work. You know, it needed to be more formal settings for him to for the clothes to work. But I found it in more recent times, which I do find confusing, is that men are, you know, making the transfer to being a woman, but they're not actually, doing, a lot of them don't seem to be doing anything to moderate their voices, lose weight, because of course a fat man and a fat woman look very different, and this sort of thing. Now, obviously I've got old and, stuck in my ways. But I just wonder, because I'd assumed that people wanted to be a woman because of the vision they'd had of it, or how they felt they were.
Okay. Let me pick up
Whereas they, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Where it seems to me that a lot of the men who've trans to women have got a very weird idea of what a woman is.
Let me pick up on, you've made lots of good points. Thank you.
Thank you.
So cross-dressing
Yeah.
is different to trans. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm just going to clarify for the recording, so that, yeah, somebody can have a male gender identity and enjoy, for whatever reason, dressing in so-called women's clothes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're trans. So it's a female gender expression. And yes, why not? And people can be heterosexual. So it might be a heterosexual man whose gender identity is clear, they're male, but enjoy dressing in female clothes. And as you say, that's not always welcomed in all situations. And there's lots of clamping down on children, isn't there? I think, that actually playing about with clothes and identity and appearance is sometimes shut down by parents or schools and so on. But yes, so that was the first point, to distinguish between cross-dressing and trans, although obviously things are complicated, and sometimes someone might start cross-dressing and then think, oh, actually, I do feel a different gender. So then the question of kind of trans enough, or making an effort for a particular appearance. So I think it's really challenging to get a voice higher. It's quite difficult to do in the first place. But also, where do the judgments come from about what people should look like? So we've got in our minds kind of stereotypes about what men and women look like. And for trans people, I think it can be quite difficult navigating all of that. So they can be accused of sort of being too female, kind of too much makeup, too much hair, too flouncy, or not enough female. I think it's very difficult to kind of get the balance right. What does somebody actually want to look like? What's possible with the body that they have? And what are the expectations of other people? Yeah, so I think it's quite a common critique or question, is criticizing somebody's appearance, but actually, again, why are we doing that? Where does that come from? We're expecting people to conform to particular ideals, and find it quite challenging if people don't fit into those nice, neat boxes. Hattie.
I've just been away this weekend, and there were a lot of people there, and I was encountering many people who were cross-dressing or maybe transgender. I couldn't tell you, but I mean the percentage was really quite high, and I was going, really? Oh my God, I see. But lots of youngsters, sort of, I suppose, 20s, and some older. And it was quite emotional. I mean, it was quite a lot of emotional about it. I mean, I didn't mind the emotion. I wasn't. Well, I suppose there were moments when I was critical, wearing a dress and then clumpy, bright trainers, which just that's odd. That's odd. Okay, but that's very consistent. The person wore that dress for a whole day, or maybe the next day as well, and I thought, okay, that's how it is. But the numbers were so surprising. 10% 10-15%, maybe more. Yeah.
What setting was that, Hattie?
A social dancing.
Yeah.
That was just fabulous.
Yes, and I think, we can't help our own judgments. We can't help it. But then it's what do we do with it next? So thinking, trainers with that dress, oh, no, not, blah. For whatever reason. Yes, but it's about how we actually act on that, whether we say something, whether we make a funny face, whether we avoid talking to them. So noticing, I think, difference between our own thoughts and emotions and then actually interacting with people.
I mean, I can't, I don't think I talked to anybody who was in that sort of, if you like, category or framework, and that's a bit sad, really. There were a lot of people there, but I talked to all sorts of other people who were age difference, ability and disability different, and that was easy.
Yeah. So do you feel that made it harder for you to approach them, or?
I think it did. I mean, it might just have been happen chance. I'm not really sure.
Yeah. I think it's just quite difficult not to be hyper conscious, isn't it? Where we perceive a difference with ourselves and thinking, oh, there is this thing that's visible to all of us, whatever that factor is, and not being weird. I think it's quite difficult. But looking for things that we've got in common.
There's a couple of things which a couple of small points. When I was younger, I was a hippie, wore a caftan and those types of things, so that was comfortable for me. It was that is what I was like with my friends, the women who identified themselves, wore the kind of the Indian print flowing dresses type of thing, and it was of the time, so that there was older people got very confused about that type of thing, but I'm wearing a dress, but they didn't think that was so different when you see a man wearing a jalaba, which was kind of nearly cultural type of thing to do with that type of thing, so that helped in that way. But the other point I'd like to express is that I worked for over 20 years with children, and sometimes with quite problem children. And I found that if they were 12 and under, they were very kind of blunt about that whole thing, and if they found a man, kind of wearing female clothing, there was no kind of gentleness to it. It was like, why is that man doing that? Or why that woman doing it? And it comes to a point where you have to try and explain gently, why this is happening, and this person. And sometimes in those times, people had to be very brave to kind of walk out in the streets, or not just in their community, to be what they are.
Yes, and I would say sometimes children take on board very quickly a new concept. So explaining to a 5-year-old or so that somebody has gone from a female name to a male name and this is now male is often just, oh, okay. But it doesn't need to be a big drama, to be honest. So I've definitely seen that a few times, that the adults around a child are thinking, oh, this is an enormous piece of news and it's going to traumatize them. And not necessarily at all, if the adults are able to, explain what a child needs to know and treat it as a piece of information. Mum.
Both of you used to be GPs. Are GPs in training in any way taught about making flash opinions of their patients as they come in?
Well, they're being taught by me, to be honest. So on Monday, I've got 109 clinicians. So that's of various nurses, doctors, students coming along to an online meeting about trans and non-binary people's access to health services. But no, it's not normally a big part of the medical training at all. So quite a lot of GPs are quite confused themselves about gender. Yes. Graham.
I'd like to ask Julia for her views on the relative merits of single-sex and mixed education.
Well, so single-sex or mixed education, just to repeat the question. I suppose, my belief is that sex and gender is much more complicated than just the two. So I went to a girls' school from 11 to 16. If there were girls in the school who were trans, so identifying as male, then what do? Do we have to take them out of that school and stick them in another school? So from that point of view, I don't think it's a great idea dividing anybody by sex or gender. On the other hand, the school that I went to, I think, kind of benefited from, it was quite a small school and it was a calmer environment perhaps than big mixed gender schools. But from what point of view, Graham, what's your...
I just wondered whether mixed schools brought up children to be less discriminating, more liberal, more open to gender dysphoria than those who've gone through single-sex school education.
Yes. So whether mixed or single-sex schools are more or less discriminating. Yeah. I mean, my brother went to a boys' school, again from 11 to 16. And in his school, there was a lot of bullying and a lot of pressure to be male, to fight, to be masculine. So I think it impacted him harmfully. And being in a girls' school for me was beneficial for me. So we were allowed to be all sorts of things, sporty or swatty or whatever, quiet, noisy. So perhaps I think it probably works differently for different children. That on balance, it's probably unhelpful to separate people by gender. So I've got a close friend who at school, when they said, right, boys in one part of the classroom, girls in the other part of the classroom, and he is trans, so was brought up as a girl, and then he just didn't know which group to join in. So he's left sort of literally in the middle thinking, well, what do I do? And a terrible kind of embarrassment and awkwardness and inner angst about this apparently simple thing of saying, right, join one line or the other. David.
Yeah, I have quite some contact with people who are on the autistic Aspie spectrum. So, many dimensions to human life. And I'm not trained at all, but I've learned to adjust my conversation. I've studied it a little bit so that I can be more effective communicating with them. And there's one who's at the intersection. So this is a trans, difficult, a trans person who is obviously autistic as well.
Yeah.
And I can understand that it's socially, it can be quite traumatic, as you've explained, coming up with figuring out your identity. And this person has some social issues. So is perhaps the simplest, can be disruptive in groups or appear disruptive in groups. It certainly has to be made allowance for and understood. And it's almost like sometimes I feel I need to address that in conversation with them, and sometimes I don't, and just ignore. I wonder if that comes up a lot, and you know what your response is.
So there does seem to be a link with the autistic spectrum and trans, which is not well understood. But there's definitely a lot of autism amongst trans people. Yes, very interesting. And one of my students did a lovely piece of research actually about autistic trans people and the difficulties of this sort of masking and proving. So sometimes you need to mask the fact that you're trans in healthcare for people to take you seriously. Sometimes you need to mask the fact that you're autistic for people to take you seriously. Sometimes you need to prove that you're trans to get healthcare. Sometimes you need to prove that you're autistic to get healthcare and help. So this sort of awful conflict and lots of emotional work trying to work out, well, what's the best thing for me to do in this circumstance? Yeah.
The third aspect to that is when perhaps because of one of these, the person is traumatized, because there's, you know, actually tackling the trauma might be something that would be a good thing to do, but I'm not qualified in any of them, so I'm interested to learn about all of
Well,
this.
it's again back to social expectations, isn't it? And when people step outside of the norms, how challenging that can be for the person themselves, and how we respond to someone who's not expressing themselves kind of normally, in inverted commas. Yeah, complicated.
Yeah, my instinct is to take an interest in somebody's trauma, you know, because the more comfortable, the more that we've tackled it or been accepted in whatever ways needed, the easier it is for people to integrate as however they are in society.
There's a really
trauma is a big blocker, in other words.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So there's an acknowledgement that trauma-informed care is a good idea, you know, to actually find out, well, what's somebody's journey into the consulting room, what's happened to them in their lives that might be in fact impacting their health today, mental health and physical health.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, one of the things that I have struggled with for a long time, I mean, I've been out as a lesbian woman for many years, but I've always had problems with being happy in a one-to-one relationship. I've currently got 2 relationships, which very roughly equate to a kind of married relationship. There's no place for people like me, I'm finding. All my lesbian friends, most of my friends are lesbians, they're in couples. They even refer to their partner as a wife or a husband. I feel really miserable about it. I hate it. I was a feminist before I decided I was a lesbian. And I just cannot understand a wish to use those old terms with really quite bad connotations. I don't understand it. I don't understand the need to be a couple, and I don't understand the terminology. And I don't know to what extent that's the fact that I'm certainly on the autism spectrum. So I would find relationship holding down a bit difficult anyway. Or is it to do with, well, you know, I just think it's a complex area, and I don't think I ever hear it discussed. Do you know of anyone who's written about it, perhaps?
Yes. So Meg John Barker, I can email some resources, but there's certainly big communities of people who are stepping away from monogamous coupling. So the polyamorous community, and that can look very different for different people. So yeah, different configurations of perhaps having a kind of primary person and then other connections at other times, or a more sort of web-like connection with other people. And the idea of kind of solo polyamory, so actually not being enmeshed and dependent on other people necessarily, but seeing ourselves as independent and then making the connections that make sense in different ways. So yes, there are definitely communities out there, and people, there's a concept of a relationship escalator, that you meet somebody, you spend loads of time with them, you sort of land up dropping your friends because they are the primary person in your life. Fiona, hi.
Hello, hi,
Welcome.
sorry to be late. I've only just been able to finish the thing I was doing before, but hello.
We're on the sort of final questions, but welcome. So relationship escalator, yeah, the idea that, you know, meet somebody, fall in love with them, they're the most important person in your life. You move in with them, you have, you know, buy a house, have children, and live happily ever after. So there's definitely lots of communities of people saying, ooh, you know, why are we assuming there is this trajectory and that it's a couple and this is what a relationship needs to look like? So you're not alone, Patsy.
That's something. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Ray?
When I was growing up as a young male, that was, you know, kind of 50s, 60s type of thing, you know, the idea then was this kind of very rigid kind of male, female, you know, you grew up, you met a partner, you know, and anyone apart from that was, you know, kind of out there, way somewhere, you know, not part of any kind of concept. And happily that has changed over the years. Now, you know, there is less stigma of a man not being a man type of thing, and learning that they have emotions also, you know, and you know, and being able to have other relationships within that. And that is nearly set now as a thing, you know, that sheer masculinity is not playing rugby and, you know, doing those kind of stereotypical masculine things. The idea of that has now changed somewhat, but it has taken quite a time. It has taken, you know, numbers of years to do this. And I think the idea, the next ideas which you are now expressing will themselves take a number of years to be able to, for more people to accept them, because this is kind of the younger generation which are very much forwarding this change in our way of thinking, a way of living. Do you think that is that?
So, you know, with kind of gay liberation, I think it's amazing that we know loads of people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual in the media. And on the tube the other day, there was an advert from a sort of home stores place featuring two gay men either side of a bed, so buying furnishings. I thought, blimey, well, that does tie into this kind of couple idea, but to see that on the tube and to think back to the 80s with Margaret Thatcher's prohibition of teaching, so-called promoting homosexuality in schools, and to just see the change that there's adverts, yeah, featuring gay people, gay, lesbian, bisexual less so that's still more stigmatized. But I think, yeah, the fight for gender equality and liberation, so stepping away from gender discrimination, so the difference in pay between men and women, the difference in expectations and privileges, and it works both ways because the expectations also restrict men's choices as well as women's choices. But yes, we've got quite a long way to go on that still. And that it's not necessarily linear either. We're not necessarily making progress. Keep having to fight for it all the time, actually. We're going backwards as well as forwards a lot of the time.
I remember the days of the start of Stonewall and people like that, you know, that had to produce these groups, organizations to for support in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so Stonewall was very much about supporting gay rights, and has more recently supported trans rights, and is in the centre of a lot of fuss about that. I mean, to me, it seems really straightforward. Trans people are very discriminated against, and I can't see what the problem is in making sure that they're not. Yeah, so there's lots of very bizarre arguments about kind of men dressing up as women in order to go into women's toilets and assault women. Well, the reality is most assaults on women are from people they know and within the family, to be honest. So it's within, family and friends, most assaults on women. So assaults by strangers are extraordinarily rare. Of course, it does happen. But assaults in toilets by men dressing up as women is just so far-fetched. It's ridiculous. Yeah. And also in society, how do we spend our energy? You know, is it worthwhile having a go at trans women? It's just bizarre. There are so many more things that we could be fighting for, far, far, far more urgent and acute issues, as the Quakers very well know. I find it very odd, and I think it's part of the divide and rule. And I actually think it may be a conspiracy, really, in order to distract attention from other issues. So while we're fighting each other, we're not noticing how our powers are being limited in so many other ways.
Any questions or comments, friends? Christopher.
Yeah, I was just going to make one comment because, of course, I was involved with the campaign for homosexual equality when I first came out. And I think, in fact, one of the things Maggie Thatcher did with Clause 28, was it? Yeah, was, you know, it seemed to me that, in fact, a lot of gay men were actually content with what they'd got and were, you know, but actually, you know, bringing that out actually revitalized the movement completely. But no, I mean, it's incredible how things have changed, you know. When I was a teenager, of course, it was all illegal. So,
yes,
you know,
yes.
So, and, you know, and recently I felt guilty because I was at a funeral, and one of the grandchildren, I just saw it at the corner of my eye, you know, well, that's a very camp gesture. And I kind of looked a bit startled, and I think he caught me and he thought I was being stuffy, whereas in fact I was thinking, gosh, things have gone a long way since my day. Yeah.
But I think there's pennies dropping about who has been excluded historically. So I came out as a lesbian in 1987, found some wonderful, wonderful clubs to go to and a real sense of community. But actually, I hadn't really realized that lots of people were excluded from that space. So it's a very white space. It wasn't a trans-friendly space. So whilst we were busy enjoying ourselves, we just didn't see who is not in the room, literally. So there's definitely this idea of intersectionality, so that our identities matter in lots of different ways, and thinking about who has the power in different spaces, and that lesbian and gay people who are white, educated, middle class, living in the Western world, actually we've got a lot of power. So while we're oppressed in some ways, we have a lot of power in other ways. So earning potential might be huge in comparison to other groups. So there are those fronts as well to make sure that we're not accidentally or on purpose excluding lots of other groups.
Can I just ask what your opinion is of, so I came out as a gay female when I was 17, so that was 2002. too. And I started going onto the scene and experiencing all of that. And because I'm quite feminine, I was quite pushed out and excluded and told you're not gay, you're bisexual, you're bicurious, all of these things. So whereas now that really doesn't happen as much. I don't go out as much, but what's your sort of view on how that interaction is between kind of, I don't know if you'd say it was gender or if it's just a community identity, I don't know.
Yeah, so I definitely know what you're talking about. And so late 80s, 90s, you know, I had a friend who liked to wear, so lesbian, who liked to wear skirts, and she was told, well, you're not welcome in this space. You're not lesbian enough. You must be bisexual, exactly as you're saying, which is ridiculous. It's nonsense, isn't it? But I think it comes from a sense of needing sort of solidarity and needing to sort of create spaces where we can identify each other and feel, okay, this is who we are. But it's then a boundary that excludes other people. So, yeah.
Okay, friends. That our the witching hour has gone and passed, and I'm afraid we must conclude this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Julie, for a very interesting hour. And now we must conclude, but
thank you so much for all of your questions and comments and for participating. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, really
thanks, Julia.
refreshing and great. And I'm sorry I missed the first bit, but really great. Thanks.
And what's next week?
Next week we have a Chris Wilmot, whose talk goes on for the title goes on for a few minutes, and it is sounds more like a religious belief than a political philosophy. How explaining liberal democracy to an American student led directly to me becoming a Quaker and other Lib Dem tales. Quite a mouthful, as you would probably think. But
it should be interesting.
It should be interesting. So remember to come at 11.